Said to say our final goodbyes to my mother and my brother, Larry. Waunita Nass was born Waunita Carr. She was the oldest daughter of James Carr Jr. and Anna Mae. She had an older brother, Douglas. She had 3 other sisters, Josephine, Bonnie, who am I forgetting? Lorraine, and 2 other brothers, Jimmy and Logan. So there were 7 children. She was the oldest daughter. She graduated from high school in 1942, and immediately after graduating high school she went to Lexington, Kentucky. She was born in Bourbon County, Kentucky, and after graduating from Great Crossing High School she went to Lexington, Kentucky, and she worked for the Irving Chute Company, which is a parachute company manufacturer in Lexington, manufacturing parachutes for the paratroopers during the war. So she did that until the war ended, and then when the war ended, she had a brother who was working in a munitions plant up here in Baraboo. Her older brother Douglas was going to get married, so she came up here for that wedding. She also had an uncle here, George Wood Robinson, and she said, you know, if I could find a job up here, I think I'd stay. Well, there was a job that he found at a feed mill in Tiffany, Wisconsin, which those of you who are from around here know it's not far. And so she applied for that position, and she was hired by Mr. Severson, who owned the mill at that time, and she was a secretary there. Not long after, a short time, then Donald and Richard, brothers, Donald and Richard Nass, took the mill over from Mr. Severson, and so she stayed on working there and fell in love with Donald. They were married on December 10th, 1949, right? It's right here. 1949, and so they made their home here. She continued to work there at the feed mill, and until, I guess, she started having kids, which was my brother and I. So my brother was born in 52, I was born in 56, and she stayed home for a little while to try and take care of us as best she could. She did go back to work, though, in early 60s, and she worked at what was then the Clinton feed mill. So she went back to the feed mill. She worked as a bookkeeper and a clerk there. And let me see, she worked there, became the Clinton Co-op eventually, but she worked there 18.5 years until, at that time, Donald had a trucking company, and so she decided to go and help out with the bookkeeping and the clerical work at the trucking company. So she did that until really, let's see, am I leaving something out? Until they retired in 88. And in 1988, Donald and Waunita, when they retired, they moved to Arizona, Mesa, Arizona, and lived out there until Donald died in 2001, October of 2001. At that time then, Waunita had the opportunity to go back to Kentucky, where she was originally from, and live with her sister, her younger sister Bonnie, who was also recently widowed the same year, in 2001. So Waunita went to live with her sister Bonnie, and the two of them lived in Kentucky together in Bonnie's house for the last 12 years. And they were peas in a pod. Everybody in the neighborhood knew the two ladies. They did a lot of entertaining. They had parties. I call them New Year's. They had a New Year's Eve party. They stayed up later than I did. They played cards. They did jigsaw puzzles. Some of you, I don't know if anybody here, but a lot of people had traveled through Kentucky, and that was always a good place to stay. It was like a hostel. You could always camp out there. All of the Loomer kids have stayed there at one time or another, for example. So it was always a treat to go and visit there. So Mom lived there then, like I say, the last 12 years, and was wanting to not have to leave home in her final days. So thanks to my brother being able to have a flexible schedule, and I was able to get free enough to go there. She was able to stay at home, and she died on June 26th. And she was there in the presence of her sister Bonnie and my brother. She is survived by her sister Bonnie, who is, by the way, 87, and her younger brothers, Jimmy and Logan. So she was preceded into death by her husband, Donald, husband of 51, 52 years, and also her brother Douglas, her sisters Josephine and Lorraine. We had funeral services at Tucker Yoakum Wilson Funeral Home. Harlan Wilson, who arranged that for us, in Kentucky, which is where most of my mother's relatives have been taken care of. Cousins, and aunts, and uncles, and grandparents, and everything. The Carr family is deep roots in that area of Kentucky. And so we did have the funeral services there on the 29th and the 30th. And because, obviously, we wanted Mom to be here next to Donald, so she would rest here now next to Donald. Yesterday, Waunita would have been 91. So her birthday would have been yesterday. She would have been 91.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate Scott and I on behalf of us. Really appreciate everyone here. I noticed Scott was kind of trying to one-up me because I thought he was going to read something, and he didn't read it. He memorized it. And he kept looking at me for hints like, is that right, is that right, is that right? So I got mine written down, but I'm going to try to do my best to move through it and do it without thinking it knows too much. But I want to say, Waunita Nass, our mom, was tender-hearted, she was gentle, she was highly moral and a godly woman. And from early age, I remember that she made sure that Scott and I went to Sunday school every Sunday. Even in winter, she would get us up in the morning, dress us in our Sunday best, load us in the car, and drive the 10 miles to church. But perhaps her motives weren't so altruistic after all, because she had a couple of wild little boys on her hands, and maybe she hoped that the church would give her a leg up on dealing with it. For example, when we were young, we were sitting at the kitchen table one evening having dinner. Scott sat on one end, I sat on the other end, and Mom sat in the middle as a referee. And one of my favorite things to do with my little brother was to tease him, and the way I liked to tease him the most was whenever he would say something, I would repeat it. And so finally he got to one thing. He said, Larry, if you don't stop copying me, I'm going to throw this fork at you. The hell of a fork. You know what I said? Larry, if you don't stop copying me, I'm going to throw it. And a moment later, that fork came flying across the table, stuck right here in my left temple, just above my left eye. I mean, it was hanging. So my mother actually whooped us both for that. But normally she was easygoing and kind, but she did have her mama bear moments. When I was about 12 years old, I had a paper route and had a customer who was neglecting to pay me. So when she learned about this, she said, Larry, get your coat on. She loaded me in the car. She drove me over to the house of this guy. She took me up with her up to the front porch. She banged on the door. When this guy came to the door, she said, you pay the money that you owe my son for his paper route. And Mr. Welch never, ever neglected paying me. And it would be remiss without telling this, because I was kind of a hero in this little story. I call it the Woolworths incident. Scott and I were little. My mom took us to Beloit, to the Woolworths store that was downtown Beloit. And she gave us some money to get some whatever we wanted, and I think we decided candy was the best thing. So she was in another part of the store, we got some candy, and then we were leaving the store, and Scott had this candy in his hand. I think I probably ate mine right away, but he had his hand. And he gets out the door, my mom and I and Scott get outside the door, and the manager from the store comes running out to the sidewalk and spins Scott around by his shoulders and says, hey, did you pay for that? Did you steal that candy bar? And my mom looked around and she said, my sons do not steal. He said, well, where's the receipt? And I said, oh, I know where the receipt is. I don't know why I did this, but when we bought the candy bar, we had the receipt, and I took the receipt and we were walking down the stationery aisle in the store. And for some crazy odd reason, I can't explain it, I opened up one of the notebooks and I stuck the receipt in the notebook. I walked this guy back down into the bowels of the store to this one notebook in this one aisle, and I lifted up the thing, and I was like a magician. I said, "Here, here's the receipt." So anyway, I probably should have let Scott, go to prison, but he was a nice guy, and he owes me for that. Getting back to the paper route incident situation, I had a paper route, and this is to kind of tell you how precious Mom considered us and how protective she was. I'd gone off to deliver my papers without my gloves. It was winter. And, I was delivering the papers. I was trying to get through as fast as I could because my hands were getting colder and colder and they were getting sore. And I finally got the paper route done, but my hands were just aching. And I ran into the house crying, and I said, Mom, my hands are hurting. She, seeing my distress, she said, "Rub your hands in my hair." Now, I don't think if you looked up on Google to do if somebody has, cold hands, you rub them in somebody's hair, but that was her solution, and I remember it made both my hands and my heart feel warm. The other thing is, I just want to touch on something about my mom and dad. We never doubted for an instant that Mom and Dad were in love with each other. They demonstrated it every day in front of us, in front of others. You all could attest to that, I'm sure. But I will say that my dad was maybe a little rough around the edges. She tamed him to some extent. And I believe it was Mom who influenced Dad to make his own decision for Christ. However, there was one of the words in Dad's colorful vocabulary he liked to use it when things weren't going right, or when something was broken or not, he couldn't fix it, and he wouldn't manage to do whatever he was trying to do. He said, "Well, let's ask backwards." And so one time he was trying to do some fiddling with something, and my mom said, "Well, you got to ask backwards." She never swore. That's the thing. She prided herself in never swearing. And she said that, and he called her Gert. That name for her, Gert. He said, "Gert, what'd you say?" I didn't say anything. Gert, you said something. So anyway, he kind of wouldn't let that go for quite a while. In 1972, I found Jesus and I gave my life to him. I got involved with the Christian Coffee House Ministry at Walworth Bible Church, and my mentor was a woman by the name of Mary Jane Birdsall. She taught me how to read the Word, have regular time with God, and how to pray. And every Friday night, you'd find her at the back corner of that coffee house, sharing the gospel and teaching the young adults how to walk. Well, my mother, from time to time, asked me questions about my newfound faith, and I remember several conversations we had concerning how to grow as a Christian. I didn't feel comfortable really talking to my mother about the Christian faith and mentoring her, so I introduced her to Mary Jane Birdsall. And they became good friends, and Mary Jane began to mentor my mother much as she had mentored me. Mary Jane and my mother even had weekly Bible studies over the phone after my mother moved to Kentucky 12 years ago. While going through my mother's things a few days ago, I came across a notebook filled with notes and teaching that was the result of her weekly conversations with Mary Jane. By the way, that's Mary Jane's gravestone. She's buried right there. But my mom was serious about her walk with Jesus. Her dedication to God was unwavering. From the early days when she took Scott and me to church until her last moments with us last week. And Bonnie, her sister, with whom she lived for the past 12 years, related this to me about a week before Mom passed. She said Mom told her that she'd had a dream. And Bonnie said, "Well, what did you dream?" And she said, I dreamed that I had died, and that I was removed to another room, and that all my things were put in another place. And then Bonnie said, "Well, Waunita, did you see your master?" And Mom replied, "Oh, yes, I've been there. She's with him now." song.
When fields are still, when striving